This old woodcut showing the story of the blind man and the elephant reminds us that any complex subject can be approached in multiple ways. And that is certainly true of a subject as complex as human nature. Anthropology can illuminate human nature by documenting universals across human societies, ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving that you can see in all human beings, as well as the ways in which cultures can vary. Biology can document how the process of evolution selected the genes that help wire the brain. Psychology can get people to disclose their foibles in laboratory studies. And even fiction can illuminate human nature by documenting the recurring themes and plots that are found in the world's myths and stories. In my book, The Stuff of Thought, I tried to give the view from language. What kind of insight into thought, emotion, and social relations we can get from words and how we use them. For example, one could use verbs as a window into our concepts of causality and moral and legal responsibility. Prepositions are a window into the human concept of space. Tense is a window into the concept of time. Naming things and babies is a window into our social networks. And swearing is a kind of window into the strong emotions that we experience. Because of limitations of time, I'm only going to show you the view through one of those windows, namely indirect speech as a window into social relationships. And I'll begin with a phenomenon. You may all recognize this character from the movie Fargo, who early in the movie has a kidnapper tied up in the backseat of a car. Inconveniently, he's pulled over by a police officer because the car is missing its plates. The officer asks him to hand over his license. He proffers his wallet with a license exposed and a $50 bill extending ever so slightly. And he says to the officer, "I was thinking that maybe the best thing would be to take care of it here in Brainerd," which of course we all recognize as a veiled bribe. This is an example of an indirect speech act, a case in which people don't blurt out exactly what they mean, but veil their intentions in innuendo, counting on their listeners to read between the lines to derive their content. And we do this all the time. For example, if you could pass the guacamole, that would be awesome. Now, when you think about it, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we all interpret it as a polite request. Anyone who has sat through a fundraising event at a university or nonprofit is familiar with euphemistic schnorring, such as, "We're counting on you to show leadership in our campaign for the future," i.e., give money. Would you like to come up and see my etchings? That has been recognized as a sexual come-on for so long that in the 1930s, James Thurber could draw a cartoon showing a confused young man saying to his date, "You wait here and I'll bring the etchings down." And then there's a nice story you got there. It would be a real shame if something happened to it, which we recognize as a veiled threat. So the puzzle is, why are bribes, requests, seductions, solicitations, and threats so often veiled when both parties know exactly what they mean? And it's not just an intellectual puzzle, but has a great deal of practical importance, such as in the crafting and interpretation of the language of diplomacy and in the prosecution of extortion, bribery, and sexual harassment, as we've all been reminded by the memoir from Clarence Thomas recounting his inauguration hearings in which the full assembled body of the Senate and House of Representatives had to figure out what he meant when he said, "Who put pubic hair on my Coke?" In particular, whether that was a sexual come-on or an innocent observation. This turns out to be a surprisingly knotty problem, and I think that the solution requires three ideas: the logic of plausible deniability, the logic of relationship negotiation, and the logic of mutual knowledge, which I'll now explain in turn. Let's start off with what game theorists call the identification problem, namely, how do you figure out the rational course of action when the outcome depends on another intelligent agent, but you don't know the agent's values? And bribing a police officer is a paradigm case. Imagine that you only had two options, issuing a naked bribe in so many words or not bribing at all. Which will lead to the better outcome? Well, it depends. It depends on what kind of policeman you're facing. If you're facing a dishonest officer, if I can use this, borrow my speaker's laser pointer? No, I guess not. How about this one? No? Okay, I'll just use the mouse. If you have a dishonest officer who would accept the bribe, you have the very high payoff of going free. If you're unlucky enough to have an honest officer, he would not only rebuff the bribe, but might arrest you for attempting to bribe an officer. Comparing the very high payoff with a very high cost against the moderate cost of a traffic ticket in both cases if you don't offer the bribe, it's not clear which of those alternatives is more attractive. But now let's say you had a third option, a veiled bribe, such as I was thinking that maybe the best thing would be to take care of it here. A dishonest officer could sniff out the bribe and accept it, giving you the high payoff of going free. An honest officer couldn't make a bribery charge stick in court by the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The worst thing he could give you is a traffic ticket. You have the very high payoff of bribing a dishonest officer with a fairly moderate cost of failing to bribe an honest officer packed into one row, and so the veiled bribe is the rational choice. Okay, this is the logic of plausible deniability, no surprise there. The puzzle is, why do people resort to indirect speech in non-legal contexts where their words aren't going to be held against them in a court of law, such as, for example, bribery in everyday life? Now, you might react to this with indignation. What do you mean, bribery in everyday life? When would a law-abiding, upstanding citizen such as myself ever be tempted to tender a bribe in everyday life? Well, how about this? You want to go to the hottest restaurant in town. You have no reservation. Why not slip the maitre d' a $20 bill in exchange for which he will seat you immediately? Well, this was the assignment given to the food writer Bruce Feiler by his editor at Gourmet magazine, who dared him to try it and write an article recounting his experience. And I found the article highly informative for 3 reasons. First of all, though as far as I know, no one has ever been sent to jail for the crime of attempting to bribe a maitre d', the assignment filled him with anxiety. He begins the article as follows: "I am nervous, truly nervous. As the taxi bounces through the trendier neighborhoods of Manhattan, I keep imagining the possible retorts of some incensed maitre d'. What kind of establishment do you think this is? How dare you insult me? Do you think you could get in with that?" Secondly, that when he did screw up the courage to offer the bribe, he instinctively did it in an indirect speech act, in an innuendo, such as, "I hope you can fit us in. Can you speed up my wait? I was wondering if you might have a cancellation." The third interesting aspect was the outcome, which is that it worked every time. As he put it, we were seated in between 2 and 4 minutes to the astonishment of my date. So what's going on here? I think what we're seeing is the fact that language has to do 2 things. It's got to convey a certain content, the bribe, the command, the proposition. At the same time, we depend on language to negotiate the type of relationship that we have with our listener. The solution is to use language at 2 levels. The speaker uses the literal form to signal the safest relationship to the listener, while counting on the listener to read between the lines to entertain a proposition that might be incompatible with that relationship. A simple case would be the polite request, as in, if you could pass the guacamole, that would be awesome. The literal content, as I mentioned, makes no sense. I think you'd have to agree it's a bit of an overstatement. It wouldn't really be inspiring of awe if the guacamole was in front of you. And also, it's irrelevant. Why are you pondering counterfactual possible worlds there in the dinner table? But the listener, assuming that the speaker has not taken leave of his senses, figures, well, the speaker says an outcome is good, therefore he must be requesting it. The overall effect is that the intended content gets through, namely the imperative, but without the presumption of dominance that ordinarily accompanies an imperative, namely the presumption that the listener will comply with your request, as if they were some kind of flunky or underling. So what other kinds of relationships do people negotiate as they speak? Dominance, it turns out, is one of 3 major kinds of human relationships that people worry about the world over. According to the anthropologist Alan Fiske, these are modes of interacting that people distinguish in all cultures. Each prescribes a distinct way of distributing resources. Each has a distinct evolutionary basis, which we will hear more about later this afternoon. And each applies most naturally to certain kinds of people, but can be extended to others through negotiation and manipulation. I've already mentioned dominance, whose ethos is "don't mess with me," and which we naturally inherited from the dominance hierarchies that are widespread throughout the primates and the animal kingdom in general. Very different from this is the relationship of communality, whose logic is share and share alike, and which evolved through the mechanisms of kin selection, which we'll hear more about, and mutualism, and which naturally apply among biological kin, between husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend, and in circles of close friends. Yet a third type of relationship is reciprocity, whose logic is you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, which evolved via the mechanism of reciprocal altruism, and which characterizes the more business-like tit-for-tat exchanges of goods and services. Now, behavior that's acceptable in one relationship type can be highly anomalous in another. For example, at a cocktail party, you might go over and help yourself to a shrimp off your girlfriend's plate. But you wouldn't go over to your boss and help yourself to a shrimp off your boss's plate. At the end of a dinner party, if you were to pull out your wallet on the way out and offer to pay the host for the cost of the food, that would not be perceived as fair, but rather as crass, because the ethos at a dinner party is one of communality rather than a reciprocal exchange. Now, those are cases where everyone knows what to do, but in cases where the relationship is ambiguous, a divergent understanding between the two parties can lead to an unpleasant emotion that we call awkwardness. For example, there can be awkward moments in a workplace where an employee doesn't know whether to address his boss on a first-name basis or to invite him out after work for a beer. It's well known that good friends should not engage in a business transaction, like one of them selling his car to the other, that the very process of negotiating the terms of the exchange will inevitably put a strain on the friendship. The conflict between dominance and sex defines the battleground of sexual harassment, and the conflict between the relationship in friendship and a sexual relationship is what gives dating its frisson and supplies the raw material for romantic comedies. So this gives rise to a social identification problem where the emotional costs of awkwardness from a mismatched relationship type can duplicate the payoff matrix of the legal identification problem where the costs can actually be reckoned in dollars and jail terms. So an example is bribing a maitre d', where the clashes between the dominance relationship that a maitre d' ordinarily wields over his restaurant fiefdom, where he seats people when and where he pleases, and the reciprocity relationship that the bribe presupposes, in which case he would be obligated to seat you in exchange for a quick table. So once again, imagine that your only alternatives were to issue a naked, bald-faced bribe or not to bribe at all. What would happen would depend on what kind of maitre d' you had. If you had a corrupt maitre d', he would consummate the reciprocity relationship and you'd get the high payoff of a quick table. On the other hand, if you had a scrupulous maitre d' who insisted on maintaining dominance and who said, do you think you can get in with that? What kind of establishment do you think this is? How dare you insult me? Then you pay the high cost of awkwardness. If you have the third option of an ambiguous bribe, such as, I was wondering if you might have a cancellation, the corrupt maitre d' could sniff out the bribe, consummate the reciprocity relationship, you get the quick table. The scrupulous maitre d' could choose to ignore it, continue to wield the dominance relationship. The worst thing that you have is a long wait. You get the high advantage of bribing a corrupt maitre d' with a relatively small cost, the long wait of failing to bribe a scrupulous maitre d', all packed in one option. Okay. There's one remaining problem, which is why do we still resort to indirectness even when there is no real uncertainty? That is, when the speaker knows the listener's values. For example, I've just told you that all maitre d's in New York are bribable. Nonetheless, I suspect you'd still use an innuendo to tender a bribe. Or when the listener knows the speaker's intent. People aren't naive, and it's not as if any woman, for example, could be fooled by the line about the etchings. Nonetheless, even though the deniability is not really plausible, we still feel that an obvious innuendo still feels more comfortable than a direct overture that's on the record. Why is that? Well, let me just remind you of the phenomenon. Early in the movie, when Harry met Sally, the two have just met. They are confined in a car for a long trip. Harry makes a comment that Sally interprets as sexual. She accuses him. "You're coming on to me." And he says, "What do you want me to do about it? I take it back, okay? I take it back." She says, "You can't take it back." "Why not?" "Because it's already out there." "Oh, geez, what are we supposed to do? Call the cops? It's already out there." So what is the status of an overture that is out there or on the record that makes it feel so much more awkward than a veiled overture that's conveyed indirectly? After all, as Harry points out, it's not as if you can call the cops. Well, I think a key concept in explaining this puzzle is what economists and logicians call mutual knowledge, which has to be distinguished from individual knowledge. In individual knowledge, A knows X and B knows X. In mutual knowledge, A knows X, B knows X, A knows that B knows X, B knows that A knows X, A knows that B knows that A knows X, ad infinitum. Well, it turns out that this is a distinction that makes an enormous logical difference. For example, why is freedom of assembly enshrined as a fundamental right in a democracy? And why are so many dictatorships terrified of the prospect of people assembling peacefully in a public square, such as we've recently seen in Burma? Well, the reason is that without an assembly, everyone might know that they detest the ruling authorities, but no one has any way to know whether everyone else feels the same way. As soon as there's a public rally and everyone can see everyone else who's there for the same reason, not only do you know that other people are disgruntled, but you know that they know that you're disgruntled, and you know that they know that everyone else is disgruntled. That gives you the collective power to challenge the authority of a dictator who otherwise would be able to pick off dissenters one at a time. Another example is The Emperor's New Clothes, which in essence is a story about mutual knowledge. When the little boy said the emperor is naked, he wasn't telling anyone anything they didn't already know, anything that they couldn't see with their own eyes. But he was conveying information nonetheless. At that moment, everyone knew that everyone else knew that the emperor was naked, and moreover, that everyone else knew that everyone else knew. And once again, that changed their relationship with the emperor, allowing them to challenge his dominance. The moral being that language is a very good way of creating mutual knowledge. So here's a hypothesis that innuendos merely provide individual knowledge, whereas direct speech provides mutual knowledge, and relationships are maintained or nullified by a mutual knowledge of the relationship type. That is, if Harry were to say, "Would you like to come up and see my etchings?" and Sally said no, well, Sally knows that she's turned down an overture. She's not naive. Harry knows that she's turned down an overture. But does Sally know that Harry knows? Sally might be thinking, maybe Harry thinks I'm naive. And does Harry know that Sally knows that he knows? Harry might be wondering, maybe Sally thinks I'm dense. There's no mutual knowledge, and so they can maintain the fiction of friendship. Whereas if Harry were to have said, "Would you like to come up and have sex?" and Sally turned him down, then Harry knows that Sally knows that Harry knows that Sally knows, and they cannot maintain the fiction of a friendship. I think that is what's behind the intuition that with a direct overture, you can't take it back. It's out there. So to sum up the argument, people often have to convey messages while unsure of their relationship. Indirect speech can minimize the risks in legal contexts with tangible costs, as in bribes and threats. The same thing can happen in everyday life because relationship mismatches can have an emotional cost. Moreover, indirect speech prevents individual knowledge from becoming mutual knowledge, and mutual knowledge is the basis for a human relationship. Just taking a big step back, what does indirect speech tell us about human social life? Well, at the bird's eye view, it tells us that humans are very, very touchy about their relationships. With some of their fellows, typically kin, lovers, and friends, humans freely share and do favors. With others, they jockey for dominance. And with still others, they trade goods and services. People distinguish these relationships sharply, and when one person breaches the logic of a relationship with another, they both suffer an emotional cost. Nonetheless, humans often risk these breaches, sometimes to get on with the business of life, sometimes to renegotiate their relationship. Finally, humans think a lot about what other humans think about them, and their relationships are ratified by this mutual knowledge. They know that others know that they know what kind of relationship they share. As a result, to preserve their relationships while transacting the business of their lives, humans often engage in hypocrisy and taboo. And that is just one of many ways in which language can serve as a window into human nature. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. Really great.